I'm going to do a recording to show you 1 point perspective, which is something that probably most people have had a go at before, but this is a bit of a refresher. So I'm going to do quite a simple shape, or a couple of shapes possibly, using 1 point perspective methods, which you can then go on and create your own shapes from afterwards. Now, 1 point perspective is one of, I would say, 3 types of perspective that you ought to be able to use. They're easy to remember because you have 1 point perspective, 2 point perspective, and then potentially 3 point perspective, although that's really more if you were doing something quite complicated. So let's get started. Now, the first thing we need to do with perspective is to decide where the object gets smaller towards the point where all of the lines converge, and that's known as the vanishing point, or I might refer to it as VP, vanishing point. The way I remember that, it's a bit like if you were standing on the seashore and you were watching a boat sailing off, and imagining it wasn't going over the horizon. At some point, that boat would get smaller and smaller and smaller until eventually it seems to disappear. It seems to vanish, okay, because it's gone so far away. That's the vanishing point. Now, what we're going to do this is an A4 piece of paper that we're looking at here, and I could give you lots of measurements, but I'm going to try and let us eye it in a little bit today. We want to find the middle of the page that way, and we're going to come down a little bit. Now, I'm not going to do that by measurement. I'm going to estimate it. Now, one way to do it, to find the middle of the page, would be to fold your page in half. In fact, I will do this, but I might as well. And then rather than folding the whole lot, if you just pinch, make sure it's sort of smooth, and just pinch that top part of your page, that will give you the middle in that direction. The problem with that, as you can see, is I kind of get a bit of a floppy page. That's now my middle. Okay. Now, with a vanishing point, you don't want it to be right in the center of the page for most objects. I'm going to position mine today about 30 mil from the top. Now, I'm making a big point of it, and that's so that you can see it. When you do any of these sorts of drawings, the first thing you try and do is draw as lightly as possible. Make sure your pencil's quite sharp. I'm possibly going to draw in pen today as well to make sure my lines are visible. But you need a sharp pencil. If you try and do this with a blunt pencil, what you'll end up with is lines that are very, very wonky, difficult to make them line up and stuff like that. So we're going to work in the bottom left-hand page. That's my demo today, and then you're going to complete the demo on the left-hand page, but then duplicate it to apply that learning yourself on the right-hand side of the page. So today my drawing's literally only going to be on the left-hand side. The point where that's sitting is above us, so we're looking is slightly below where our viewpoint will be. We're going to be looking down on our object, okay, because of the position of that. When you're messing around with perspective, adjusting the position of the vanishing point will make a really big difference to the kind of drawing that you produce, and it's worth thinking about what happens. If I was to put it in the middle, I'll get a very pointy one. If I put it below, I get a view as though I'm looking up at something. So it's worth playing with, and certainly if you look at like comic artists and graphic artists, they'll often use perspective to make things more impactful, more interesting to look at. I'm going to draw a simple side profile of let's call it an IKEA chair. I'm making it up because I want to keep it quite blocky. And I'm going to do that near the edge of my page. All right, so I'm going to basically be drawing down here. Now, if you look at where I'm drawing my lines, it's very faint there at the moment. I haven't done any measurement or anything, but I will do it in a minute to get that correct. So I'm going to use my ruler, my steel rule, and I'm going to just straighten up the line. I want you to work with a rule today, because if you don't, what you'll end up with is very difficult to match up lines. Now, I didn't measure that in from the edge of the page, but I did make sure I wasn't at the edge of the page. I've left a space. I've also made sure I'm below about halfway on my page. The reasons for that will become clear later. So if you've ended up drawing something all the way up to the top of the page, then you need to readjust your drawing a little bit, so you're below the halfway point on the page. So again, I'm going to just rough in my IKEA chair profile so I know where I'm going. Now, again, you could do measurements for this. If I look at my thickness of my line there, it's about between 1.5 and 2 centimeters, 15 mil or 20 mil. I'm not going to measure it because I don't need to. but we'll take it to there. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw a line down parallel with this one. Okay, I'm going to stop it about there. Alright, so I'm eyeing this in a little bit. If this was a proper engineering drawing, I'd be expecting you to use real measurements. I'm going to just slightly use the edge of that ruler there to bring my next bit off. And then again, I'm going to come down at 90 degrees. I could use the corner of my ruler. Now, sometimes I do this with set squares and all sorts of stuff, but I'm conscious that some of you might not have access to that at home, so I'm just doing it with a ruler. You can do it with any straight edge. It doesn't have to be a steel rule. Okay, so if I look at that, I can see that line there is going to be longer than that line. And that's one of the benefits of doing it really lightly, first of all. I'm drawing dark so that you can see it, but the lighter you work in the first place, the less you need to think about rubbing out. And then finally, what I'm going to do is I'm going to estimate my feet of my chair here, trying to make sure that, remember, if this is a chair, it's going to sit on the floor, so they do have to be flat. Okay, and again, I'm going to just bring that line in. Now I want my chair to be approximately the same thickness here as it is here, so I'm going to just take a moment to get that right. Now again, I could use measurement for this, and if I was doing an engineering drawing, I certainly would. But for now, for the purpose of this activity, a little bit of estimation is absolutely fine. There we go. So there's my chair. All right, now this is what we call the side profile, side elevation, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to take each of these points and I'm going to draw to my vanishing point. Now this is where it's really, really important. I'll show you a couple of mistakes that people make. They'll find the corner here, but then they won't find the vanishing point there. Or they'll find the vanishing point there, and they won't find that corner there. What you have to do is to make sure you actually have that lined up. Now I'm going to draw this. Remember, I've talked about construction lines. I'm going to draw this a little bit lighter. Still not as light as I would draw it if I wasn't videoing it. It needs to be a nice sharp line. We're not going to use all of that line. Now again, by not drawing it too dark, we don't have to rub out too much later on. I'm going to do the same thing now for each of these corners. Now when you've done that, you might find if your shape is closer to the middle, this might be really, really steep. It might be a really shallow sort of angle here. And what you've got to think about is the position of your shape. Now it might be at this point, if it looks awful, start that again. You want it to be quite a lot of distance between there and the middle of the page. Otherwise this won't work properly. Right, so the next thing, parallel. Parallel is wherever you have two lines which will never meet. It doesn't matter what angle those lines are at, providing they are at the same angle as each other, and they will never meet no matter how long they get. So we're going to do lines which are parallel to our front edge. All right. So the way I sometimes teach that is to put the pencil down and to then take your straight edge and put it parallel with your pencil. That then means that you can pick your pencil up and draw your line. So I'm going to do that now. Now I'm just going to go between those two lines. Okay, so you'll start to see the shape arriving now. There's my, I would say, front edge, back edge. So the next one, we're going to do front edge, we're going to do this line here, and back edge. Okay, that's how we do it. Line those two up, bring that into position, pick up your pencil and draw that line. So you'll notice that I'm just drawing between the lines. There's my front edge. There's my back edge. This is one of those things where it takes a while to get your eye in, but once you kind of think about where you're going, it's actually very straightforward. And sometimes you don't need that pencil. The ideal is that you begin to sketch in perspective without having to use straight edges sometimes, and that comes with practice. So we should now be able to see my IKEA chair. Now, the keen-eyed in amongst you will hopefully have noticed that I'm missing at least one line. Okay, because I've got my edges here, I've got my depth here. It's this line here, and I've deliberately left that one out when I was doing my lines to the vanishing point. You would only see that running all the way through under certain conditions. One is if the object was transparent. So you'd only need to run that through if the object was transparent. Two is if you were using it for graphic purposes to show some hidden detail and how things fitted together. So what I'm going to do this time to finish that line off, I'm going to go back to my vanishing point and I'm going to stop it when I reach that face there. So I'm not going all the way through. It could potentially go all the way up there. So you'll notice there that I've stopped it. Now again, depending on what scale you've done this drawing, you're going to find that your object or this line might come near that corner, it might come closer to that corner, it might be that it's a very different sort of shape. But providing you're following that rule where that line goes to that vanishing point, then you're doing it okay. All right. Now, what I'm going to do next is I'm going to turn this into a slightly more of a chair object by cutting a bit out of the middle. All right. Now, I want this bit to be on this line here, in this area here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use this thickness and I'm going to plot it across to give me my starting point. And this is where plotting and projection is quite an important skill in design and technology and engineering, where you take a known part and you use that to predict your next part. So if I take that line there, I'm going to just make a little mark. Okay, so there's my small mark. I'll make that really big so that you can see it. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go off to my vanishing point. Again, I only necessarily need to do this in the shape that I'm drawing. So I'll go there. I could go all the way to the vanishing point. All right, so that is now the front face. And if you look at it, you can begin to see the effect of perspective quite easily now. This back edge here is beginning to be quite a lot smaller than that front edge there. The other funny thing that happens in perspective is as things get further away, they're going to appear narrower. Now, I could do this with measurement and I could do this with all sorts of plotting. That's not the purpose of this assignment. So we're going to estimate again. This foot here, I'm going to make slightly shorter than that one. So I'm going to make that mark. So that's quite wide. I'm making that one quite wide. I'm going to draw in parallel with this edge straight up until I meet that top. Okay, now this is where you've got to rely on the rules of perspective. Do you see that? That, although it looks like it was going to be the same size, is actually a much narrower line. It's going to get even more extreme here. Now I'm going to estimate, this is quite large. This back leg, I'm going to need to make quite a lot smaller. So I'm going to estimate it there. And this time I'm going to do it parallel. Because it's a vertical, I'm going to make sure that this one is parallel. And draw that line in. Okay. Now, before I go any further, I've got one more line to draw in and then it's pretty much done. I'm just going to darken in the bottom of those 2 feet, just to remind me of what I'm drawing. Okay, and now I'm going to darken in the top. And then my final line, again, this is one where we kind of give it its proper depth. The final line that we're going to do is going to be the line that runs parallel with these, and it's going to be here. Okay, so it's that line there I'm taking up to there, and I'm only going to go to the next object. Now I'm using a steel rule, which you can't see through. It might be a bit easier for you if you were using a clear rule. So there we go, there's our object. Now I could leave it at that, but actually for me I want to make sure that my back legs are also following this same system. Now again, I can use projection now, because I've got to this point. I can use projection to actually plot in that back leg, and I can do that. I know where that line is, and I know where that corner is, so those are my starting point for plotting there. So I'm checking that I'm parallel with this line really, and I can look at that one and I can see, I won't actually see that back foot there, so the only one I've got to draw is the rear version of this one, and I know it goes upright because there's my front edge, so my back edge has to be parallel with my front edge, and that will give me that rear foot. Okay, let's get another pencil with a rubber. So if I now rub out that line there, ooh, this is horrid rubber. That now shows me that back foot. Okay, so that's my sort of IKEA chair. Maybe I'm doing a disservice to IKEA. That's my minimalist chair, my brutalist chair. And what I could then do is to go on and add tone and colour to it. So I'm just going to very quickly blast through that. I'm not going to spend hours doing it, because for me the important thing today is that you get your perspective right. The next bit really is to give yourself the challenge of duplicating that or something similar, or maybe it's a park bench, on this side of the drawing. Okay, keeping roughly the same proportions. But let's just do a bit of tone work for a second. So I always think the top is going to be the lightest. So that's a surface facing up and facing up. Then I'm going to have a mid-tone where it's facing inwards. And then I'm going to have a darker tone where it's facing left to right. Okay, that's there and there. Now, that's my personal drawing preference, and it doesn't always work out depending on what shape you're doing. But so my starting point, I tend to do a light block of colour on most of my shape. Now, I'm going quite quickly. I want you to be a bit careful with your edges. I quite often see people do a lovely drawing and then spoil it because they haven't taken the time to get their colouring built up lightly and all the gaps filled in. So if you're leaving gaps and you're seeing white bits, you probably need to go over it again. I try and always colour in the same direction as well. Now I'm trying not to turn my page for the sake of this video. Quite often I'll be whizzing my page round 360 degrees whilst I'm doing a drawing like this, but I'm keeping it still for you. And you can see I'm putting basically a block of colour that's the same on pretty much the whole shape, because none of this is white. So just finish this off. Right, so I've got some colour on there. You can see this is a bit of what I would call a lazy bit of colouring in, because I haven't actually blocked it in properly. So again, I'll go over that again, because otherwise it'll spoil the effect that I'm trying to achieve. What you don't really want to see is individual pencil lines, but if you go too dark in the first place, you end up with everything being the same tone. So I think build it up over a period of time. Right, so these are my light ones, light, light, and then I'm going to go for my darkest ones. That's going to be dark and that's going to be dark. So I'm going to really give those a bit of extra oomph. So I'm pushing down a little bit harder. I'm still taking care that I stay within my lines. and building it up a bit at a time. When you buy slightly better quality colouring pencils, it does give you a big difference in terms of how well you can colour in. If you're using really cheap ones, they just don't work as well. They're harder, they're a bit more brittle. So sometimes spending a couple of pounds instead of 60p could make a big difference. I'm not saying you've got to buy some of those sets that are like 30 or 40 pounds, but if you were to spend £4 or £5, you'll get some really, really nice colours for that. So you can see here I'm building up. I'm probably doing like superhero speed colouring on the video, but I'm just going at normal pace really. So I've built up that block of colour there, and the same thing here. Now I'm still not at full dark. I think now what I'm going to do to add a bit of impact now, so I've got my kind of light tone, I've got my medium tone, which actually I'm going to go over one more time. So that's actually now had three goes, and as I say, I'd normally just be spinning this around a little bit to get a slightly better quality on it. Right, now finally what I'm going to do is I'm going to give this a bit more impact. I'm still not totally satisfied. Where I've got objects which are underneath, they're going to be in shade, so I'm going to just now use a little bit of extra going over, but I'm going to blend it out a little bit. So I'm using my tone work to give the effect of shadow that's fading away. Okay, so hopefully you can see that. Now I could go on and on doing that, but I'm going to leave it at that point. The only other thing I would probably suggest that you do, and I don't think I've got any colouring pencils to do that with at the moment, is possibly to use a different colour around it, just to add a little bit of impact, shelf shout I call it. I'll just do that for a moment with a grey. I wouldn't normally do this with a drawing pencil because it gets very smudgy. So you can take your object. Ooh, that looks horrible. Use a colouring pencil. Don't do it like this because it looks like I'm not putting attention to it. I'm going to stop before it gets too nasty. So do that with a colouring pencil. So something with a contrast, a bit of green or a bit of yellow or a bit of red even, will make that look much better. I'll end up redrawing that, I know I will. So your task is to draw that shape, to do a bit of tone work to it, then to add an object onto the right hand side. 1 point perspective. We'll do some others later on where we look at things above the vanishing point and look at things where maybe one is offset from another. Remember, the whole idea of this is that you get more confident with your actual sketching. So if I was doing a drawing, I might automatically go off towards an imaginary vanishing point without really worrying too much about getting it precise. But I can do that because in the past I've spent a bit of time with perspective. All right, so the idea of perspective is it allows you to be accurate, but it also opens up the opportunity to be a bit more confident with your own sketching. Anyway, good luck with that. Hope that works out all right for you.